Hello, Biology 210. Welcome to the new semester. This is Mrs. Colley speaking to you, and hopefully you've had an opportunity to watch some of the other videos that I had up on Blackboard, the course introduction, the syllabus walkthrough, so my voice might sound familiar to you, might look familiar to you. We've got a lot to unpack in this first portion of the semester, this first chapter, so let's go ahead and get rolling on that. But I'm very glad that you're here with me and paying attention to what we've got to say. Students always ask me at the beginning of the semester what they can expect from this course, and I always say what we want out of this course is success. We want happiness and rainbows and puppies and kittens, and success to me as an instructor kind of means two things. The first is that you've learned something and earned a good grade, and the second was that it was relatively stress-free. We want to reduce the amount of stress it takes to be successful in the course. And I think if you guys pay attention to the material, stay on top, don't get behind, listen to the instructions and advice that I have for you over the course of the semester, that's what you're going to end up with. But what I see are some students that fight the course a little bit, they fight the material, they fight the pace, and they kind of end up having this experience instead. So we want to make sure we're all rainbows, puppies and kittens as we get started. That includes going ahead and grabbing the notes that we have available for you on Blackboard. So each chapter will be presented to you in a PowerPoint presentation like this video. You have a series of notes that correspond directly with the chapter. You print those out or have them available on your laptop, whatever you're doing to fill in the notes as we talk. So they're blanks along the way. We're adding information. We're filling in those blanks. I'm giving you examples. We're talking about that material for the various chapters. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 1. And then what you have in the notes, what we've talked about in these PowerPoint lectures, is what you're responsible for on lecture exams. So let's go ahead and get started and see how this works. Chapter 1 is sort of an introduction to the human body. We're interested in overall orientation to the material, to the subject, the topics, etc. So this is chapter 1, very first portion of the online free textbook that you have access to. And I want to let you know that all of my lectures throughout the semester are going to correspond with that textbook. So if you're going through the textbook and you're looking and finding good diagrams, additional examples, good material, you'll see that the material that we talk about, the notes, follows the textbook. So that could be a very valuable resource for you. And of course it's free. There's a link on Blackboard to the textbook. I encourage you to follow along. All right, so introduction to the human body. This is an anatomy and physiology course. That's the name of the course. So we should probably figure out what that's all about. And we take this course in the form of a combination. We look at form following function. Some institutions, some universities have a separate anatomy course and you take that one semester, and then a physiology course, you take that a second semester. We combine them together. That's the way your textbook introduces the material. That's the way we talk about it. We sort of refer to that as form following function. We study the human body as a combination of internal and external structures and how they interact and react with each other. That's the philosophy behind this semester. So we start off by saying, okay, anatomy, that's the name of the course. What's it mean? Anatomy is a scientific study of body structures. It's parts. It's putting a name to something. If you are labeling, what do you call that? What do you call that muscle? What do you call that bone? What do you call that body cavity? That's anatomy. It's parts. It's pieces. It's what does it look like? What label do we put on it? Now we can be a little bit more specific when we're talking about anatomy. And now we're going to the notes and we see the first term, macroscopic anatomy. Macro means large. It's the opposite term to micro, which might be familiar, meaning tiny or small. And we have an AKA. The first blank in the notes that you'll see is where I would like you to write gross anatomy. AKA, also known as, I love these, Mrs. Colley, that's me, I'm your instructor, I love AKAs. These are two terms that essentially mean exactly the same thing. These are two terms that are interchangeable when it comes to a definition. So if I asked you on a quiz or on an exam, which one would you put? Well, the idea is either one of them would work. They're equally valid. But what I love to do with AKA is just kind of give you a little bit of a heads up. I like to give you one and just a blank next to it and say, what's the AKA? So I might say macroscopic anatomy, AKA blank. You would write gross anatomy. I might flip it around and say gross anatomy, AKA blank, macroscopic. I love AKAs, one thing you can do as you're going through the notes and learning the material is pull out anytime I have an AKA and make sure you're comfortable with that. You typically have a whole section of those on exams and quizzes. So what is macroscopic anatomy? We look at it from a surface perspective, things that are on the superficial portion or the top portion of the body. And that could be like superficial musculature. Notice we're labeling things, we're naming muscles. That's classic anatomy, the muscles on the surface portion. We could look at regional macroscopic anatomy. We're looking at sort of a zone or a specific area. We might specialize in anatomy of the hand or the head or the leg. Okay, we can also have systemic macroscopic anatomy. We're talking about a system, a body system. And there are lots of body systems, anything that has that word on it, digestive system, respiratory system, endocrine system, lymphatic system. That's what we're talking about. We can also have developmental anatomy. This is the idea that your body changes as you grow. Your pancreas is larger, your bones are longer, things change as you develop from an infant to an adult, and those changes along the way are what we refer to as developmental anatomy. We're naming something, we're putting a label on it, that's anatomy. We can have macroscopic and microscopic. Microscopic anatomy is something that's going to require magnification because the structure is small. Classically, we think about a microscope or magnifying glass assisting us in making something larger. And two categories under microscopic anatomy are the discipline of cytology. Cytology, cyto, C-Y-T-O, means cell, translates to mean cell. So this is the study of cells, specifically the study of internal cellular structures. And I know we got a lot of labels here, but if you're familiar with internal organelles, things like Golgi apparatus, nucleus, mitochondria, when we're reviewing those structures and labeling them, where do they occur, what do we call them, that's cytology. The other type of microscopic anatomy is histology. Histology is the study of tissue. We look under the microscope and we identify various tissue types and structures like a series of nuclei that we see here. That discipline, we'll be doing a lot of that in lab, that discipline is histology. Anatomy, we're putting a label on it. The second part of A&P, anatomy and physiology, is of course physiology. So physiology by comparison is the scientific study of function. We want to know, what does it do? How is it able to do that? So in anatomy, we're putting a name to it. In physiology, we're talking about what it does, its overall function. And just like specific discipline, we can have some information associated with physiology. We could be talking about cell physiology. Pretty straightforward. This is how cells function to do what they do. Not all cells are round with a round nucleus in the middle. They have varying structure, that's anatomy, because they have varying function. Perhaps you recognize this neuron conducting electricity for the cell. You can have organ physiology. There's an AKA here, organ or special physiology, where we zoom in on a specific organ. This is where we might have a specialist, like a cardiologist, specifically interested in what's happening with the heart, that sort of thing. Endocrinologist interested in the glands of the body, and here happens to be my favorite organ, so I use it as a wonderful example. This is the spleen. If we were interested in the specific function and action of the spleen, we would be looking at organ physiology. We could look at the function of the entire system, how all of the parts of the digestive system work together to digest the food. Here's another example. We might recognize some of the anatomy, the kidneys, the urinary bladder, how it functions, how we make urine, how we pass that urine through the tubes. That would be systemic physiology. And then I have a little puddle of a little stuffed urine. They make amazing things these days. Okay, so I add that in to see if you're paying attention. All right, we also have what we call pathological physiology. And this is sort of the basis of medicine and clinical environment. Pathology is disease or non-function. So the function of disease, when things aren't functioning properly, you're sick, you're in pain, you're diseased, and we need to be able to recognize disease process to figure out how it's not working so we can correct it. Maybe that's therapy, maybe that's medicine. We can correct it and getting it functioning properly back to normal, pain-free health. Pathological physiology is the function of disease. So the next section of this chapter is talking about just in general how we organize our thoughts as a biological science, because this is Biology 210. We look at all organisms, including ourselves, which is the focus for this class, and we have a hierarchy. The hierarchy is organizational levels. Typically, you start a hierarchy with a small level. It's a low level, physically small, and we build up. We put those small things together to build the next level, so it's a little larger, a little more complicated. We take those things, build it into something a little larger. We make our way to the full understanding. So we're going to do that with our hierarchy. We're going to start with sort of small and simple and build to larger and more complex aspects of human anatomy and physiology. All living things are going to begin at a chemical level. So we talk a little bit about atoms. We think about atomic structure, and you might be familiar with things like protons, neutrons, electrons. If those sound familiar, that's going to be very useful in the next chapter. But we take these sort of atomic structures, these atoms, we put them together. We're building something a little bit larger. Atoms come together to form compounds. And compounds can be fairly complex, and we see all sorts of chemical nomenclature in the textbook and in examples. But compounds are just atoms coming together. A good example here, H2O. Two atoms of hydrogen, that's an element, bonded to one atom of oxygen. Put a couple of those atoms together and we get water. CO2, carbon dioxide, is just another example of a compound. The one here in the left-hand corner, that's glucose, the compound glucose, very important sugar in the body. But we put atoms together, we build compounds, very chemical sounding. We take compounds and we build cells. Remember, cytology was the study of those cells. Cells come together to form tissues in the human body, and there are four major types of tissue. We'll be seeing this in the lab and reinforcing it, but tissue comes in the forms of epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, nervous tissue. Those will sound familiar to you eventually. We take those tissues, combine them together, and tissues form organs. What that means is each organ, the stomach, the spleen, the brain, the lungs, is composed of a little bit of each of those tissues, a little bit of connective tissue, a little bit of epithelial tissue. And organs in the human body are any organ that we would point to and name, classic anatomy, the heart, the lungs, the liver, the kidneys, the brain, the spleen. Those are organs. We put those organs together in groups and call them organ systems. I mentioned these earlier. Most of these are pretty straightforward. Skeletal system, those are your bones. Circulatory system, that's your blood vessels, your heart. Some of them might be a little odd. Integumentary, that's the skin. Endocrine, those are the glands. Lymphatic, that involves the spleen. If you're not familiar with the organ systems, just the general terminology, you've got a nice spread in your textbook that walks you through all of the organ systems in the human body. We put all of the systems together, all the muscles, all the bones, all the internal structures. All the organs come together in our hierarchy to form the culmination, the organism. And in this class, that's you. That's what we're interested in studying, the organism, and that's the purpose of this course. The hierarchy kind of walks us through how we're going to investigate anatomy and physiology. The next few chapters are going to start at kind of the chemical level, then we're going to work our way through a chapter associated with cells and then tissues and then body systems. So this kind of outlines how the book is laid out and how our investigation in anatomy and physiology is going to be laid out. The organism. You have a nice picture in your textbook, just sort of visually gives you a hint. We start with molecules and make our way to compounds and cells and tissues and organ systems and the organism. The third portion of this chapter is dealing with functions associated with human life, and we have some terminology here that we're adding in. Remember, this chapter is all introduction, so we're getting some terms that we're likely going to use throughout the rest of the semester. So we want to make sure we're comfortable with terms like metabolism. Metabolism is essentially the chemistry of the body. So we can define this once again the way that your textbook does. The sum of all chemical reactions in the body, but this is building up and breaking down and all the chemistry. We don't know exactly what's going on, but we know there's some chemistry. For instance, we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. So there's some chemistry going on with our respiratory system somewhere. We know there's chemicals involved. Chemistry can get a little bit daunting and complicated, but what we need to recognize is that there are two basic fundamental types of metabolic reactions. And the first is what we call an anabolism. Sometimes we say anabolistic reaction, and this is a building reaction. A good term for building is a synthesis. So we just kind of recognize that term. We're making something. We're putting pieces together. And in order to do that, we're going to have an input of energy. Energy is like the glue that sticks our chemicals together. We're either building something or we're breaking it down. A breakdown is a catabolism or a catabolistic reaction. We're going to rip things apart. Maybe this is digestion as an example, where we're ripping down our food into individual chemicals. And energy is going to be released as we pull the bonds of the chemicals apart. This is chemistry. You're fundamentally either building something up or breaking something down. Living things are also associated with responsiveness. What that means is they respond to the environment, they adjust to changes, they adjust to stimuli, and that's our term. Responsiveness can be changes both external changes. You see something coming at you, what are you going to do? You're going to scream, you're going to fight, you're going to run. Internal, something's changed, your stomach was empty and now it's full of food. Your body's going to respond to those changes appropriately. We also have the ability to move, and just like our previous slide, that motion can be external movement where we're running around our whole body, moving our muscles, or internal movement where we're, for example, pushing blood through the circulatory system, pushing food through the digestive system, pushing cerebrospinal fluid around our brain. Living things, human beings, have the ability to move externally and internally. We develop and grow. Our body changes both anatomy and physiology through life. We increase in size, for instance, from birth. Things change as we get older. This is a principle for all living things. We also have the capacity to reproduce. That's sexual reproduction, combination of DNA from mom and dad. And I always love to throw this picture up. This is my best friend's son. His name is Ian, and he's now 14 years old. But I love to embarrass him by telling his mother and him, oh, I popped your picture up. And he always kind of goes, no, no. Anyway, we have the ability, living things can make offspring, combine DNA from mom and dad. All organisms can do this. We produce sexually. You know, dogs have puppies, lions have cubs, plants have seeds, and human beings can produce babies. And then the last concept that we talk about is a very important term in anatomy and physiology. It's what we call homeostasis. Homeostasis. This is a complicated process, so we're going to kind of break it down and say that it's essentially the ability of our bodies to monitor and maintain a stable internal environment. Sometimes we think about homeostasis as kind of a balance, so we see the old-timey scales here. But there are two aspects, and I've underlined them in this definition, that we want to kind of think about. Monitor and maintain. Monitor the internal environment. So our body is constantly asking itself, do we have enough of something? Are we in range? Do we have the right amount of? And examples might be the right amount of blood sugar, the right amount of iron, the correct temperature. Somebody's got to ask, how are we doing on temperature? Hey, how's that glucose level? Hey, how are we doing with the iron in the blood? And we're monitoring to make sure we have just the right amount. We're at a wonderful set point or within range. And then if something is out of range, if we're monitoring and we discover, hey, something's not right, we then have to fix it. And that's the second part of homeostasis, which is maintaining. We got to get it back in range. Sometimes in my introductory class, I'll say that staying in range is in whack, and when you're out of range, you're out of whack, and you got to bring it back into whack. I don't know if you're familiar with that phrasing, but that's the idea. We want to make sure everything's fine, and if not, we've got to fix it. So here's some examples of temperature and maybe potassium level with bananas. We're looking at certain chemicals and we're deciding, how are we doing? Do we have the right amount? And if not, how do we fix it? Homeostasis requires a couple of things. We have to have sensors. We have to have somebody who's monitoring the impact of, or the levels of. Monitor the range, monitor the set point. And just a couple of examples might be the hypothalamus in the brain monitoring temperature. It might be the stretch receptors in the cervix, right, monitoring the position and size of a developing offspring. Something's got to be able to tell what's going on. And if there's a change, we have to react. And that's going to be under control centers. We're going to react to changes, react to deviations. There are two primary control centers in the human body. The first is the nervous system. We think about the brain, the spinal cord, electricity. It's fast. The advantage of electricity is that it is fast, but the message is short-lived. So we zap it. If we want the message to go again, we've got to zap it again. We compare the nervous system to the endocrine system. These are glands and hormones circulating through the bloodstream. It's a little slower to react, but the message is sustained, so the action continues long term. Control centers, they're going to send information to effectors. Effectors are basically boots on the ground. Effectors are who causes the change. So we've decided something's wrong. The brain has sent out a signal. So who's going to fix it? That's the effector. They cause the change. So they get an electrical signal, they get a hormone signal, and then they do something. They move, they secrete, they stop secreting, they increase production. They do something. Those are the effectors in homeostasis. And if you think about that overall, you've got a nice diagram in your textbook. I reference it here where we're thinking about balance kind of at the bottom. When we're out of balance, we have to know there's a problem. That's the sensor. We have to figure out what to do about it and issue a command. That's control. And then we've actually got to do the action. That's an effector to try to bring things back into balance. Homeostasis. How do you know it worked? Homeostasis has several what we call feedback mechanisms, way to determine, hey, did it work? The most common kind is negative feedback. And negative feedback involves something out of whack, something out of normal, something out of range. It's going to trigger a response. With feedback, you always want to know what starts the process and what stops the process. So in negative feedback, what starts the process is we're out of range, we're not at set point, that's green light. So what stops the process is when things are restored, the body goes, oh, it's good, and stops any response that it had initiated. So red light is just normal range, we're back where we need to be, we acknowledge that, process over. Okay. A good example of that is feedback with temperature. Okay. As the body temperature rises, you sweat, the body temperature drops, and then you realize, oh, okay, I don't need to sweat anymore. I'm back where I need to be. Temperature is the classic example. You have a set point, your air conditioning system kicks on or your heating system kicks on when that set point is either too high or too low, and then the system stops blowing air, stops moving things through the ducts when it's back in its normal range. That's the classic negative feedback. We do have temperature control in your brain, and so for the notes, the thermostat of the brain is a structure known as the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus. So you can have negative feedback or positive feedback. And we begin the same way. Change from normal is the start. So green light is the change. But what happens is change causes more change. That change then causes more change. So a very common term associated with positive feedback is an exaggeration or intensification. Something causes something causes something causes something. I like to refer to this as the snowball effect. If you're familiar with that, you start at the top of the mountain with a little tiny snowball, and as it rolls down the hill, it picks up snow and gets bigger and bigger, and as it gets bigger, it picks up more snow, and by the time it rolls all the way down to the end of the hill, it's huge. That's what's happening with positive feedback. Change is getting exaggerated. The only thing that's going to stop that is essentially the nervous system stepping in and saying, whoop, we're done. Right? Something else, an outside force. We don't mean outside of the body. We mean outside of whoever is having this intense, exaggerated reaction. The nervous system's kind of like the dad that comes in and shuts down the party, the police that come and shuts down the party. Hey, we're done. It's over. Listen to me. That's going to be the nervous system, and that's going to be our red light. A couple of examples of positive feedback. Your textbook talks about blood clotting. The clot, forms more of a clot, forms more of a clot. It's like a house party. People keep showing up, keep showing up, keep showing up. And finally the nervous system has to step in and say, whoa, that's good. We've got a beautiful blood clot. The job is done. Childbirth is the same way. The body has to react to pushing, and that pushing creates more pushing. God bless every mother out there, by the way. Pushing creates more pushing. This is labor and delivery. At some point, the body has to acknowledge the baby's out. We need to stop that process. Positive feedback. Okay, the last part of this chapter is dealing with specific terms in anatomy. Anatomical terminology, and we're going to reference a specific orientation of the body. We call it anatomical position, and when we look at anatomical position, it's an individual standing upright, face forwards, hands slightly out to the side, palms forward. We reference anatomical position when we're talking about where we find various organs or structures in the body. We need a consistent, same way everybody does it every single time, we need a consistent way of referencing the human body. Because the human body can change position, right? We can bend, we can flex, we can be standing on our head. Think about where the hand is relative to the head. Well, if we're waving at someone, that might change. Our hand could be above our head, behind our head. We need something that's the same always, that everybody references when talking about the human body. And that's anatomical position, what you see here. And two terms, when we're not in anatomical position, sometimes when we think about a patient, we think about a patient facing down. We call that prone, versus supine. When a patient is facing up, perhaps on a gurney or a stretcher. Prone is down, supine is up. A good way of remembering that supine has the word up in it. Supine is face up. Those are alternates to anatomical position. When we look at anatomical position, sometimes we look at body landmarks where we're labeling. This is anatomy, so we're labeling. We're labeling various areas. What do we call the region of the hand? What do we call the region at the back of the knee? We're going to be doing a lot of reinforcing here in the lab, so you'll see some of these landmarks, but your textbook walks you through a couple of nice diagrams giving you terminology. We can also think about the human body in 4 quadrants. Quad means 4. So we look at the abdominopelvic cavity and we divide it into 4 equal sections. These are pretty straightforward when we name them. Right and left, upper and lower. Now the only thing that might be tricky here is making sure we are recognizing that it is the patient's right and left. So we say patient right and left, stage right and left, if we're familiar with that terminology. It's always going to be the opposite mirror image. It's going to be the opposite of you. It's not your right and left. It's the patient, it's the diagrams, right and left. But sometimes you'll see someone will come into an emergency room and they'll say gunshot to the right upper quadrant. Right? And everybody knows, all the professionals know, to focus on that particular area. Quadrant, right upper, right lower, left upper, left lower. We can talk about quadrants. We can also talk about regions. So we can further divide the abdominopelvic cavity into 9. We sort of put a hashtag or a number sign over the abdominopelvic cavity, and we name each of those specific zones. Right and left, once again, patient left, stage left, diagram left. On the top we have the right hypochondriac and the left hypochondriac. And here we can see what organs or portions of organs can be found in each of those. We have a right and left lumbar. Lumbar references your lower back. And then we have an AKA here. We have a right and left inguinal. That's an interesting one to say. Inguinal, also known as iliac, AKA. So right and left inguinal, right and left iliac. We go down the middle, we have the epigastric region, the umbilical region. Your umbilicus is your belly button, umbilical, and hypogastric. What I love to do is give you this diagram, kind of put an X in one of these zones and have you identify the region. Now read your question carefully, because I might ask you to name the quadrant. That's going to be one of the 4 that we just mentioned on the previous slide, or name the specific region. If I use that term, we're looking for one of the 9. We also have terminology to how we orient to the body, whether it's further from the body, above the body, behind the body, structures, things like superior, inferior, lateral, medial, proximal, distal. Your textbook walks you through a few of these terms. Primarily, we're going to be looking at these and reinforcing them in the lab, but we do recognize that we see some of this terminology in Chapter 1. We can also look at body sections or planes. This is where we cut the body in various ways. So this could be an actual cut like a chainsaw, or it could be a virtual cut, something that we made with an MRI or a CT scan. And we want to recognize what we call planes or sections. We've got some AKAs in here. The first is what we call a transverse, aka cross section. And what a transverse section results in are top and bottom pieces, superior and inferior parts. So when we look at the whole body or a structure within the whole body and we cut it in half and we get a top and a bottom, a superior and inferior, that's a transverse. So here we are. Yay, we're learning about anatomy. And we make any cut that's going to separate a top portion, superior portion, from a bottom portion. That's a cross section. That's a transverse section. The second combo, and we have an AKA here as well, frontal section or a coronal. And a frontal results in a front and a back, anterior and posterior parts. We make our cut, we get a front and a back portion. So we see the plane is represented by the blue. We get the front face versus the back of the head. Those parts are separated in a frontal or a coronal section. And then we have a sagittal section. Sagittal is going to give you left and right. Now pay attention to how you spell sagittal. I've been teaching this class a long time and this is one that drives me bonkers. I see sagittal spelled with 2 G's, 2 T's, 1 G, 1 T, every combination. 1 G, 2 T's in sagittal. Results in left and right parts or portions. Now sometimes those portions might be equal. So we would call these left and right halves. We go right down the body midline and the portions are halves. But we don't have to go down the middle. We can still get left and right parts if we're slightly off to the side. And that results in a parasagittal section. We're still getting left and right portions, but those portions are not equal. So we wouldn't call those halves. We'd say there's a right portion and a left portion as a result of a parasagittal cut. And then the very last idea, we've got a diagram where we talk about the various cavities. Cavities are just spaces where we're going to put stuff. Like the cranial cavity is a space where we put the brain. The thoracic cavity is the space where we're going to have the heart and the lungs. The abdominal cavity is where we're going to put all the viscera or the guts. So we have an overall diagram, and it's good for anatomy to make sure we're comfortable with our body cavities. And guess what? We have finished Chapter 1. So I appreciate your attention. If you have any questions or concerns, how the notes work, whether or not you need any specific information or clarification, please find me. I'm very, very happy that you stayed with me all the way to the end of Chapter 1. Thank you.